My husband didn't just file for divorce. He did it 3 weeks after becoming CEO, when the company we built was finally worth millions, and when he believed I had become unnecessary. He stood in our living room, calm, rehearsed, almost polite. The papers were already signed on his end. He spoke like a man delivering good news to himself. What he didn't realize was this: the empire he was walking away with had been quietly built on decisions I made when no one was watching, and protections I put in place long before he ever sat in that corner office. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about patience, about leverage, and about what happens when someone mistakes your silence for weakness. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. They saw him as a visionary, a leader, a man who had made it. They saw me as the wife who stood behind him in photos, smiling, quiet, supportive. But stories, real stories, don't live on the surface. What happens when ambition grows faster than gratitude? What happens when love becomes transactional? And what happens when the person you underestimate turns out to be the one holding the keys? Stay with me, because the truth doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives precisely when it's needed. Before the title, before the skyline offices, before the tailored suits and boardroom applause, there was a kitchen table. Brandon and I met in our late 20s at a startup networking event in Austin, Texas. We didn't have much, but we had plans. He had ambition. I had structure. He dreamed big. I listened carefully. While he talked about growth, I asked questions about risk, about ownership, about what happens after success. I was working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm, the kind of job that taught you to read between the lines of balance sheets and spot vulnerabilities before they became crises. Brandon was selling software solutions, bouncing between contracts, full of energy, but light on follow-through. He had the vision. I had the discipline. And somehow, in those early conversations over bad conference room coffee and late-night phone calls, we started building something that felt like partnership. Real partnership. The kind where you finish each other's sentences, not because you're trying to be romantic, but because you're thinking through the same problem from different angles and arriving at the same conclusion. When he told me he wanted to start his own company, a tech consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses automate their operations, I didn't just encourage him, I helped him plan it. We sat at my apartment's tiny kitchen table with a laptop, a legal pad, and a shared belief that if we were careful, if we were smart, we could actually make this work. I reviewed his business model. I pointed out the gaps. I asked the hard questions he didn't want to hear. What if clients don't pay on time? What if you need to scale faster than expected? What if you can't find good talent in time? What if the technology changes and we're stuck with outdated solutions? What if something happens to you? He smiled at that last one, the kind of smile that said I was overthinking it. But I wasn't. I was protecting us. I had seen too many businesses fail, not because the idea was bad, but because the foundation was weak, because people got excited about the dream and forgot to plan for the reality. I wasn't going to let that happen to us. When he launched the company, I wasn't just cheering from the sidelines. I was there late at night, reviewing proposals, catching inconsistencies, reminding him of deadlines he forgot. I didn't take a formal title. I didn't need credit. I believed in us. I kept my day job for the first 2 years, funneling my income into the business when cash flow ran thin. There were months when my paycheck was the only thing keeping the lights on. Months when Brandon was chasing big contracts that never materialized, and I was quietly covering rent, covering payroll for the 2 employees we'd hired, covering the software subscriptions and the office space and the insurance premiums. I didn't complain. I didn't keep score. I just did what needed to be done because that's what partners do. I connected him with clients through my network. I negotiated terms on contracts he would have signed too quickly. And when money was tight, it wasn't his confidence that saved us. It was my caution. I insisted we set up an LLC structure that protected our personal assets. I made sure our operating agreement included contingencies for decision-making authority, profit distribution, and what would happen if one partner wanted to exit. I researched every clause. I asked questions that made the lawyer pause and reconsider his standard templates. I wanted protections that were specific to us, to our situation, to the particular risks we were taking. Brandon signed everything I put in front of him, barely reading it. He trusted me. Or maybe he just didn't think the details mattered. He was focused on the big picture, on the vision of what the company could become, and I was focused on making sure we survived long enough to get there. But caution rarely gets applause. And over time, as the company grew, as revenue climbed, as clients started coming to us instead of us chasing them, the memory of those early struggles seemed to fade from his mind. The late nights became his story, the risks became his courage, and I became the woman who had supported him, not the woman who had built the foundation. I remember the first time someone introduced me as Brandon's wife instead of his business partner. We were at an industry event, one of those networking mixes where everyone's trying to make connections and hand out business cards. A potential client walked up, shook Brandon's hand, and said, "So, this is the wife?" Brandon laughed and said yes, and I smiled politely, and the moment passed. But something shifted in me that night, because I realized that no matter how much I contributed, no matter how many hours I put in, no matter how many decisions I made that kept us afloat, I would always be introduced as the wife first. And the work I did would always be invisible unless I fought to make it seen. I didn't fight. Not then. I told myself it didn't matter, that I knew my value even if others didn't. That Brandon knew. That was enough. But looking back now, I realize I was wrong, because if your contributions only exist in private, in whispered acknowledgements and unspoken gratitude, then they don't exist at all when the partnership ends. And partnerships always end, either in success or separation. And you better make sure the record is clear before that moment arrives. Success doesn't always announce itself with joy. Sometimes it arrives with distance. The promotion changed him, not suddenly, but subtly. New conversations, new silences. Meetings replaced dinners. Phone calls replaced eye contact. It started about 4 years into the business. We had landed a major contract with a regional healthcare network, the kind of deal that doubled our revenue overnight and required us to hire 15 new employees in 3 months. Brandon was thriving in the chaos. He loved the pressure, the visibility, the feeling of being needed. He started traveling more. Dallas, Denver, Seattle. He'd call me from hotel rooms, his voice buzzing with adrenaline, telling me about pitches that went well, investors who were interested, opportunities that were just around the corner. I was happy for him, proud even. But I also noticed the shift. He stopped asking for my opinion, stopped running decisions by me. When I'd offer thoughts on a new hire or a contract term, he'd nod politely and then do what he was going to do anyway. It wasn't malicious. It was automatic. He had become the face of the company, and somewhere along the way, he started believing that meant he was the company. The house started feeling emptier even when he was home. He'd sit at the dinner table scrolling through emails, half listening to whatever I was saying, responding with generic affirmations that told me he wasn't really there. We stopped talking about the business. We stopped talking about much of anything. I'd ask him how his day was and he'd say, "Fine, busy, you know how it is." And I did know. But I also knew that busy was becoming an excuse, a wall he was building between us. One evening I tried to bring it up. We were sitting on the couch, the television on, but neither of us watching it. I said, "I feel like we're roommates instead of partners." He looked at me, surprised, like he hadn't noticed. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, we don't talk anymore. We don't connect. You're always working or thinking about work, and I'm just here." He sighed. That particular sigh that means a person is about to dismiss your feelings as an overreaction. "I'm building something," he said. "For us. This is for our future." "But what's the point of a future if we're not in it together?" I asked. He didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't want to say it out loud yet. Then came the CEO announcement. The board of directors, a small group we had assembled as the company formalized, voted unanimously to give Brandon the official title. It made sense on paper. He was the public leader. He handled the clients. He delivered the vision. I had remained in the background by choice, continuing my consulting work part-time, advising on strategy, managing some of the financial oversight, but never stepping into the spotlight. I didn't want the spotlight. I never had. But I also didn't expect to become invisible. The night he got the title, we went out to dinner. He ordered champagne. He talked about the future, about scaling nationally, about hiring a chief operating officer, about maybe taking the company public someday. He was glowing. I was quiet. And at some point during that dinner, I realized he was talking about his future, not ours. Every sentence was I'm going to expand. I'm going to hire. I'm going to scale. Not we, not us, just him. And I sat there, sipping champagne that tasted like disappointment, wondering when I had been edited out of the story we were supposed to be writing together. 3 weeks later, he came home early on a Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when he walked in and set his briefcase down with a heaviness that didn't match his usual energy. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, and then he said it. "I think we need to talk." I put the knife down. I already knew. You don't spend a decade with someone and not recognize the tone of a goodbye. He told me he'd been unhappy for a while, that we'd grown apart, that he didn't feel the connection anymore. He said it calmly, like he'd rehearsed it, like he was delivering a performance review. No shouting, no accusation, just paperwork. He had already consulted a lawyer, already drafted a separation agreement, already decided how this was going to go. He handed me a folder. Inside were documents outlining the terms. I would get a settlement based on my contributions as a supporting spouse. He would keep the company. It was clean, simple, insulting. What he didn't ask, what he didn't want to know, was how much of that growth had been shared and how much had been protected. I looked at him, standing there, waiting for my reaction, and I felt something strange. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. Because in that moment, I realized that this wasn't about love dying. This was about value being reassessed. He had decided I was no longer necessary, that my contributions were in the past and his success was in the present, that he could walk away from me the same way you walk away from a loan you've paid off. Grateful, maybe, but finished. That night, after he left the room, I sat alone at the kitchen table and realized something important. This wasn't emotional. It was strategic. He wasn't leaving because he didn't love me. He was leaving because he didn't think he needed me. And strategy is something I understand very well. Because what Brandon didn't know was that the foundation he stood on wasn't as solid as he believed. The company he thought was his had layers he'd never bothered to examine. And the woman he was dismissing had spent years making sure that if this moment ever came, she wouldn't be powerless. Divorce isn't loud at first. It's quiet, paper-heavy, polite. Lawyers spoke in calm tones. Numbers were exchanged. Assumptions were made. Brandon assumed I would fight emotionally. He was prepared for tears, for arguments, for me to beg him to reconsider. What he wasn't prepared for was silence. I hired an attorney, a sharp woman named Helen, who had a reputation for being methodical and unshakable. When we met for the first time, she asked me what I wanted. I told her the truth. I wanted what was fair, not what was easy, not what was fast, what was accurate. She raised an eyebrow. "Most people come in here wanting blood," she said. "I'm not most people," I replied. Helen smiled. "Then, let's get to work." The first few weeks were standard: financial disclosures, asset listings, debt accounting. Brandon's lawyer sent over a proposal that was, on the surface, reasonable. He would keep the business. I would get a settlement based on the current valuation and my contributions as a supporting spouse. It was clean, simple, insulting. Because the math didn't account for the years I had funded the business with my income. It didn't account for the clients I had brought in. It didn't account for the systems I had built. It treated me like someone who had been adjacent to success instead of foundational to it. And that, more than anything, told me exactly how Brandon saw me now. As someone who had been there, not someone who had made it possible. While he was celebrating his new title and planning his next expansion, I was reviewing documents I hadn't touched in years. Old agreements, early signatures, contingencies he once brushed off when I insisted we just be careful. I pulled out the original operating agreement we had signed when we formed the LLC. I reread every clause, every provision, every protection I had quietly woven in during those early days when Brandon was too focused on the vision to care about the fine print. There it was. Buried in Section 7, Subsection 3. A stipulation that in the event of dissolution of marriage, any business entity formed during the marriage with shared financial contributions would require a full forensic audit to determine equitable distribution of ownership, not just valuation-based settlement. Brandon had signed it without reading it. His lawyer hadn't prioritized it because it looked like standard protective language, but it wasn't standard. It was specific, and it was powerful. I remembered the day I wrote that clause. We were sitting at a lawyer's office, a solo practitioner who helped us set up the LLC for $800. Brandon was impatient, checking his phone, ready to move on to the next thing. I was reading every word. I asked the lawyer if we could add language that protected both partners in case of unforeseen circumstances. He shrugged and said, sure, as long as both parties agree. Brandon glanced up, nodded, signed. He didn't ask what it meant. He trusted me, and I had trusted that one day, trust might not be enough. Helen's eyes lit up when I showed her the clause. This changes everything, she said. We filed a motion to enforce the audit provision. Brandon's lawyer pushed back, argued it was unnecessary, that the business valuation was straightforward, but the language was airtight. The judge agreed. The audit was ordered, and that's when things started to shift. The auditors weren't just looking at revenue and profit. They were examining contributions, financial, operational, strategic. They wanted to know who had funded the initial startup costs, who had brought in the first clients, who had negotiated key contracts, who had made decisions that directly impacted growth. I provided documentation for everything. Bank statements showing my income, funding the business in year 1 and year 2, email threads showing client introductions from my network, contracts I had reviewed and revised before Brandon signed them, meeting notes where I had flagged risks that were later avoided. It wasn't about proving he didn't work hard. It was about proving I had worked too, and that my work had value, quantifiable value. Brandon started to realize this wasn't going to be quick. He called me once, bypassing the lawyers, his voice tight with frustration. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. I could hear the confusion in his tone, like he genuinely didn't understand. "I'm not doing anything," I said calmly. "I'm just making sure the truth is clear. We built this together, Brandon. You don't get to rewrite history because it's convenient." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought you'd be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," I replied. "You're just realizing that reasonable doesn't mean silent." He hung up. I sat there holding the phone, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. Because this wasn't about punishing him. It was about refusing to disappear. About refusing to let my contributions be erased just because they were inconvenient to his narrative. How many times had I sat quietly while he took credit for ideas we had brainstormed together? How many times had I watched him pitch strategies I had developed and never once corrected the record because I thought partnership meant putting ego aside? Too many times. And now, when it mattered most, I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The audit process was exhausting, not because of the work, but because of what it forced me to confront. Every document I pulled, every email I reread, every bank statement I highlighted, it was a reminder of how much I had given and how little I had asked for in return. There were nights I sat at my desk, surrounded by papers, and wondered if I was doing the right thing, if fighting for recognition made me petty, if insisting on fairness made me vindictive. But then I'd remember the way Brandon had handed me those divorce papers, the calm certainty in his voice, the assumption that I would just accept whatever he offered. And I'd remember that this wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity, about refusing to let someone rewrite your value just because they no longer need you. I thought about all the women I knew who had supported their partners through school, through career changes, through business launches, only to be left the moment success arrived. Women who had been told their contributions didn't count because they weren't the ones in the spotlight. Women who had walked away with settlements that barely covered a year's rent, while their ex-partners lived in houses built on foundations they had laid. I didn't want to be one of those women. I didn't want my daughter, if I ever had one, to think that supporting someone meant erasing yourself. So I kept going. I kept documenting. I kept building my case. Not because I wanted to hurt Brandon, but because I needed to prove, to myself as much as to anyone else, that I had mattered. The audit took 3 months. During that time, Brandon and I barely spoke. When we did, it was through lawyers, through mediated phone calls, through carefully worded emails that felt more like legal briefs than conversations between two people who had once shared a life. He was angry at first, then defensive, then, slowly, something else. Uncertain. I could hear it in his tone during the few times we had to speak directly. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like doubt, like he was starting to question his own version of events. The auditors delivered their report on a Thursday morning. Helen called me an hour after receiving it. "You need to see this," she said. I met her at her office that afternoon. She slid the report across the table, a thick bound document with highlighted sections and sticky notes marking key pages. I started reading. The findings were detailed, methodical, and damning in their precision. According to the forensic analysis, my financial contributions in the first 2 years of the business constituted 42% of the startup capital. My client referrals accounted for 38% of the initial revenue base. My contract reviews had saved the company an estimated $215,000 in avoided legal disputes and unfavorable terms. And the operational structure I had helped design, the systems for project management, client onboarding, and financial tracking, were still in use, virtually unchanged, as the backbone of the company's current operations. The report went further. It detailed specific instances where my advice had directly influenced major decisions. A contract with a manufacturing client that I had insisted we restructure to avoid liability issues, which later became one of our most profitable long-term relationships. A hiring decision where I had recommended a candidate Brandon was ready to pass over, who ended up becoming the company's top project manager. A financial strategy I had developed during a cash flow crisis that kept us solvent until a major payment came through. All of it documented, all of it quantified, all of it undeniable. The auditors concluded that my role was not that of a supportive spouse. It was that of a co-founder, one whose contributions had been systematically minimized as the company grew, and whose equity share, had it been formalized at the time, would have entitled me to a significantly higher stake than the settlement Brandon's team had proposed. Helen leaned back in her chair. "This isn't just about money anymore," she said. "This is about recognition." I nodded slowly, letting the weight of it settle. I had known I contributed. I had lived it. But seeing it quantified, validated, acknowledged by people who had no reason to take my side, it hit differently. It felt like being seen after years of being overlooked, like someone had finally turned on the lights in a room I'd been sitting in alone. The mediation session that followed was different from the others. Brandon walked in looking tired. His lawyer looked tense. Helen laid out the findings calmly, walking through each section, each number, each conclusion. Brandon listened in silence. I watched his face as the reality sank in. This wasn't a fight he could win with charm or confidence. This was data, and data doesn't negotiate. At one point, his lawyer tried to argue that contributions didn't equal ownership, that the business had grown well beyond the early years, that Brandon's leadership was the primary driver of success. Helen cut him off, politely but firmly. "Leadership is valuable," she said, "but so is foundation. You don't get to build a house and then claim the ground beneath it doesn't matter." The room went quiet. Brandon looked at me for the first time in weeks, really looked at me. I could see the question in his eyes. Why didn't you fight for this earlier? Why didn't you demand recognition when it mattered? And I wanted to tell him, because I loved you, because I believed partnership didn't need scorekeeping, because I thought you saw me even when no one else did. But I didn't say any of that. I just held his gaze. Because some lessons don't land in words, they land in consequences. His lawyer tried one more angle. He suggested that even if my contributions were significant, they were made voluntarily, without expectation of equity, that I had chosen to remain in the background, that I couldn't now claim ownership of decisions I had made years ago. Helen smiled, the kind of smile that meant she'd been waiting for exactly this argument. She pulled out another document, an email I had sent to Brandon 6 years earlier, when the company was just starting to gain traction. In it, I had asked him if we should formalize my role, if we should discuss equity, if we should make sure the partnership we had in private was reflected in the business structure. He had responded with a single line, "Let's not complicate things right now. We'll figure it out when we're bigger. We never did. Because by the time we were bigger, I had already been rewritten as the supportive wife instead of the business partner. And that rewriting, that casual dismissal of a conversation that should have happened, was now the thing that undermined his entire case. Because I had tried, I had asked, and he had deflected, not out of malice but out of convenience, and now that convenience was costing him. The divorce finalized 4 months later. No headlines, no courtroom drama, just truth, signed, sealed, and accepted. The final settlement was significantly different from Brandon's original proposal. I received a 40% equity stake in the company, which I could either retain as a silent partner or sell back to Brandon over time at a fair market valuation. I chose to retain it, not because I wanted control, but because I wanted him to remember. Every quarter, when the profit distributions came through, he would see my name. Every board meeting, my vote would matter. Every decision, he'd know I was still there, not as the woman he left, but as the partner he underestimated. Brandon kept his CEO title, he kept his office, he kept his vision, but he didn't keep his certainty, and honestly, that felt like enough, because the greatest victory isn't watching someone fall, it's watching yourself stand, knowing you never needed permission to be powerful. I moved out of the house we'd shared and into a smaller place closer to downtown. It was quieter, simpler, mine. For the first time in over a decade, I decorated a space exactly the way I wanted it. No compromises, no consultations, just my taste, my choices, my peace. I started taking on more consulting work, this time on my own terms, advising startups on structure, equity, and protection. I became the person I wish I'd had when Brandon and I started. Someone who asked the hard questions. Someone who made sure the quiet contributors didn't get erased. Someone who understood that helping someone build their dream shouldn't mean abandoning your own. One evening, about 6 months after everything was finalized, I got a text from Brandon. Just 3 words. You were right. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond, to say something gracious or cutting or final. But I didn't, because I wasn't waiting for his validation anymore. I had my own. Some people mistake patience for weakness, others mistake silence for absence. But wisdom waits, and when it speaks clearly, not with rage, not with bitterness, but with precision. And that precision, that refusal to be diminished, that insistence on truth even when it's uncomfortable, that's the power people don't see coming, because loud power is easy to recognize. It's the person at the front of the room, the person making the decisions, the person getting the credit. But quiet power is different. It's the person building the systems, the person asking the questions that prevent disasters, the person making sure that when everything falls apart, there's a plan. And that quiet power, when it finally asserts itself, is unstoppable. Not because it's aggressive, but because it's grounded in truth. And truth, when properly documented, is the most powerful weapon you can have. Looking back now, I don't regret the years I spent building something with Brandon. I don't even regret the pain of watching it unravel, because that unraveling taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. Your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it, and protection isn't paranoia. It's self-respect, practiced in advance. Brandon thought the divorce would be the end of my involvement in his success. Instead, it became the beginning of my own. Not louder, not flashier, but solid, unshakable, built on a foundation I laid myself. And that foundation, unlike his assumptions, will never crumble. I started speaking at events for women entrepreneurs, sharing my story, not as a cautionary tale but as a roadmap, teaching them how to protect themselves, how to document their contributions, how to make sure they never became invisible in their own success stories. The response was overwhelming. Women would come up to me afterward, some with tears in their eyes, telling me they recognized themselves in my story, that they had been the quiet ones, the supportive ones, the ones who made things possible, and then watched someone else take the credit. And now, armed with knowledge and strategy, they were going to make sure that never happened again. That became my purpose. Not to tear down the Brandons of the world, but to lift up the women who were doing the work without recognition, to make sure they knew their worth, to make sure they protected it. to make sure that when their moment of reckoning came, they were ready. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who benefited from your support? Have you ever sat quietly, watching someone take credit for work you did, wondering if speaking up would make you seem petty or bitter? Would you have handled this differently, or was patience the real strength? I want to know what you think, because these stories aren't just about one person's experience. They're about patterns we all recognize, the quiet sacrifices, the invisible labor, the moments when you realize you've been building someone else's dream while yours sat waiting. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this resonated. Tell me if you've been there. Tell me what you would have done differently. Tell me if you're in a similar situation right now and what you're going to do about it. Your experiences matter more than you think. They remind others they're not alone. They create a community of people who understand that contribution doesn't always come with recognition, but it should always come with protection. And if this story stayed with you, there's more coming. Stories about loyalty, timing, ambition, and the quiet cost of being underestimated. Stories about people who were dismissed and came back stronger. Stories about partnerships that ended and new beginnings that followed. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's next. Until then, remember this. Not everyone who walks away understands what they're leaving behind, but you don't need them to understand. You just need to know your worth and protect it, always, because the world will take from you whatever you allow it to take. And the people closest to you, the ones who benefit most from your contributions, are sometimes the most likely to forget how much you gave, not because they're malicious, but because comfort breeds complacency. And when people get comfortable with your contributions, they start to see them as given instead of earned, as background instead of foundation. And that's when you become invisible, not because you stopped mattering, but because they stopped looking. Now let's talk about what you can actually learn from this, because storytelling is powerful, but action is what protects you. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's this. Documentation and foresight are not signs of distrust. They are signs of wisdom. Whether you're building a business, entering a partnership, or even just contributing financially to something you believe in, you need to protect yourself on paper, not just in principle. Here's what that looks like in practice. First, always formalize contributions. If you're putting money into a business, even a spouse's business, document it. Is it a loan? Is it an investment? Is it a gift? Get it in writing. Keep bank statements. Keep transfer records. Keep emails that discuss what the money is for. Because memory fades, and when things go wrong, people rewrite history to suit their narrative. You need proof that can't be argued with. I learned this the hard way, but I learned it early enough that it saved me. Every dollar I put into Brandon's company, I documented. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I understood that trust and protection aren't opposites. You can trust someone completely and still keep records. In fact, that's exactly what responsible partnership looks like. Second, understand equity versus support. There's a massive difference between being a supportive partner and being a business partner. If you're doing work that directly contributes to a company's growth, bringing in clients, managing operations, advising on strategy, reviewing contracts, making financial decisions, you're not just being supportive, you're adding value. And value deserves equity. Don't let anyone, even someone you love, convince you that your contributions are just part of being a good partner. If your work has impact, it has worth. Negotiate that worth up front. Have the conversation before it becomes awkward, before the business is worth millions, and suddenly everyone has opinions about who deserves what. Have it when the business is just an idea on a napkin. When it's easy to say yes because there's nothing to lose yet. That's when you establish your stake. That's when you protect your future. And if the other person resists, if they get uncomfortable with the idea of formalizing your role, that's a red flag. Not necessarily a deal breaker, but definitely something to pay attention to, because people who value your contributions shouldn't have a problem recognizing them legally. Third, learn the basics of business structure. You don't need to be a lawyer, but you need to understand how LLCs work, how operating agreements function, how ownership is divided, and what happens in the event of divorce, death, or dissolution. Most people sign documents without reading them because they trust the other person or because legal language feels intimidating. But those documents determine your future. Read them. Ask questions. Hire someone to explain them if you need to. Ignorance is not protection. It's vulnerability. When Brandon and I set up our LLC, I spent hours researching every clause. I read articles, I watched videos, I talked to other business owners. I made sure I understood not just what we were signing, but what it meant 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, in the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. And that knowledge, that time investment, was what saved me when everything fell apart. Because I had written protections into our agreement that even Brandon's lawyer didn't catch until it was too late. That's the power of education. That's the power of asking questions, even when everyone else in the room wants to move on. Fourth, build your own financial independence. No matter how secure your relationship feels, no matter how much you trust your partner, you need your own money, your own credit, your own accounts. This isn't about planning for failure. It's about maintaining autonomy. Financial dependence makes it nearly impossible to leave a bad situation, and it makes it easy for people to dismiss your contributions because you didn't earn the money. You were just spending someone else's. Even if you're not working full-time, even if you're managing the home or raising kids or supporting your partner's career, make sure you have access, visibility, and control over your financial life. Open a bank account in your name. Build your credit. Keep some money separate, not hidden, just separate, so that if the worst happens, you have options, so that you never have to stay in a situation because you can't afford to leave. Financial independence isn't about distrust. It's about dignity. It's about making sure you always have the ability to choose your path instead of being forced down one because you have no alternatives. Fifth, don't underestimate the power of quiet leverage. The reason this story ended the way it did wasn't because of a dramatic confrontation. It was because of decisions made years earlier, decisions that seemed minor at the time but became critical when everything fell apart. Leverage isn't about manipulation. It's about preparation. It's about making sure that if the worst happens, you're not starting from zero. It's about building protections into your life that you hope you never need, but are grateful for if you do. Think of it like insurance. You don't buy home insurance because you want your house to burn down. You buy it because you want to be protected if it does. Legal protections, financial independence, documented contributions, these are your insurance policies. And the best time to set them up is before you need them. Because once you need them, it's often too late. Once the relationship is ending, once the partnership is dissolving, once the trust is gone, that's when people fight hardest to protect what they think is theirs. And if you don't have documentation, if you don't have leverage, if you don't have proof of your contributions, you're starting that fight from a position of weakness. And that's exactly where Brandon wanted me. Weak, grateful for whatever he offered, willing to walk away quietly because I had no other choice. But I did have a choice, because I had prepared for this moment years before I knew it was coming. Sixth, keep contemporaneous records. This is something most people don't think about until it's too late. Contemporaneous means, at the time something happens, not months or years later, when you're trying to reconstruct events from memory. If you have an important conversation about the business, send a follow-up email summarizing what was discussed. If you make a financial contribution, note what it was for. If you bring in a client, document how that connection happened. These records don't have to be formal or elaborate. They just have to exist. Because when you're in court or in mediation and someone is questioning whether you really contributed what you say you contributed, your word against theirs isn't enough. But your word, plus emails, plus bank records, plus meeting notes, that's evidence. And evidence wins. I had emails going back 7 years, texts, calendar entries, showing meetings I attended, notes I had taken during strategy sessions, all of it stored in folders I had never expected to need. But when I did need them, they were there, complete, organized, undeniable, and that made all the difference. Seventh, understand the concept of sweat equity. Sweat equity is the value you add to a business through your work, your expertise, your time, even if you're not being paid a salary. Courts recognize sweat equity in many situations, especially in marriages where one spouse contributes to the other's business. But you have to be able to prove it. You have to show what you did, when you did it, and how it contributed to the business's success. This is where documentation becomes critical. If you're reviewing contracts, keep copies of your edits and notes. If you're bringing in clients, document those introductions. If you're advising on strategy, send emails outlining your recommendations. Make your contributions visible and trackable. Because invisible contributions, no matter how valuable, are nearly impossible to prove years later. And if you can't prove them, they don't exist legally. They might exist in your memory, in your sense of what you gave, but memory doesn't hold up in court. Documentation does. Eighth, know your state's laws on marital property and business ownership. Every state is different. Some are community property states, where everything acquired during marriage is owned equally by both spouses. Others are equitable distribution states, where property is divided fairly but not necessarily equally. Some states protect businesses started before marriage differently than businesses started during marriage. Some states consider professional degrees and licenses as marital property. You need to know the rules in your state because they determine what you're entitled to and what you have to fight for. I lived in Texas, a community property state, which meant that anything acquired during our marriage was presumed to be owned 50-50. But Brandon's lawyer tried to argue that the business was his separate property because he was the one running it. They failed because I had documentation showing my contributions. But if I had been in a different state with different laws, the outcome might have been different. Know your legal landscape. It matters. Ninth, consider a post-nuptial agreement if you're already married. Most people know about prenuptial agreements, contracts signed before marriage, that determine how assets will be divided if the marriage ends. But fewer people know about post-nuptial agreements, which serve the same purpose, but are signed after the marriage has already begun. If you're in a situation where you're contributing to a business or where financial dynamics are changing significantly, a postnup can protect you. It's not romantic, it's not fun to discuss, but it's practical, and it shows that both parties are willing to be clear and honest about expectations. Brandon and I never had a prenup or a postnup. We were young and in love, and convinced that planning for divorce meant inviting it. That was naive. Planning for divorce doesn't invite it any more than having a will invites death. It's just responsible. It's just acknowledging that things change and making sure everyone is protected if they do. 10th, get professional help early. Don't wait until you're in crisis to talk to a lawyer or a financial advisor. Have those conversations now, while things are still good, while you're making decisions about structure and ownership and contribution. A few $100s spent on legal advice up front can save you tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands, or millions down the road. When Brandon and I were setting up the LLC, I insisted we pay for a real lawyer, not just use an online template. Brandon thought it was a waste of money. We could do it ourselves for $50, he said, but I pushed back. And that lawyer, the one who helped me write the clauses that protected me years later, was worth every penny. Professional help isn't an expense, it's an investment. In your future, in your security, in your peace of mind. 11th, don't let guilt or fear stop you from protecting yourself. This is the hardest one. Because when you love someone, when you're building something together, it feels wrong to think about what happens if it falls apart. It feels like you're being cynical or untrusting or pessimistic. But protection isn't pessimism. It's realism. It's acknowledging that people change, circumstances change, feelings change, and making sure you're not left vulnerable when they do. I felt guilty every time I insisted on formalizing something or documenting a contribution. I worried Brandon would think I didn't trust him, but I pushed through that guilt because I knew that my future self might need these protections. And she did. And I'm so grateful I didn't let fear or guilt stop me from doing what was necessary. 12th, teach your children these lessons. If you have kids, especially daughters, teach them early that their contributions have value, that they should never make themselves small to make someone else comfortable, that they should document their work and negotiate their worth and protect their future. Teach them that love and protection aren't opposites, that you can build something beautiful with someone and still make sure you're safe if it crumbles. Teach them to ask questions, to read contracts, to understand money, to never sign something they don't fully understand. These lessons are gifts. They're armor. They're the difference between a daughter who walks away from a bad situation with nothing and a daughter who walks away with dignity and security intact. I don't have children yet, but if I do, these will be among the first lessons I teach them, not because I want them to be cynical, but because I want them to be protected. And finally, 13th, remember that this isn't about winning or losing. It's about fairness. It's about making sure that the truth is told accurately, that contributions are recognized, that people are valued for what they actually gave, not dismissed because it's convenient. When I fought for my equity in Brandon's company, I wasn't trying to destroy him. I wasn't trying to take everything he'd built. I was trying to make sure the record reflected reality, that the woman who had funded the startup, who had brought in the clients, who had designed the systems, who had made it possible for him to focus on the vision because she was handling the foundation, that woman wasn't erased, that she was seen, that she was valued, that she was protected. And that's what I want for you. Not revenge, not bitterness, not endless legal battles, just fairness, just truth, just the security that comes from knowing you did everything you could to protect yourself, and the recognition that comes from having your contributions acknowledged. So here's your action plan, your homework, your next steps, if you're in a situation where any of this applies to you. First, sit down this week and make a list of every contribution you've made to any shared venture, business, project, or goal. Write down dates if you can remember them. Write down specifics, money you contributed, clients you brought in, work you did, advice you gave, decisions you influenced. Get it all out of your head and onto paper. Second, gather documentation for everything you listed. Bank statements, emails, texts, calendar entries, anything that proves your contributions were real and significant. Organize it. Store it somewhere safe. Cloud storage is good because it can't be lost or destroyed. Third, if you don't already have separate financial accounts, open them this week. Even if you're in a happy relationship, even if you trust your partner completely, financial independence is not optional. It's essential. Fourth, schedule a consultation with a family law attorney in your state, not because you're planning to divorce, but because you need to understand your rights and your risks. Most attorneys will do a free or low-cost initial consultation. Take advantage of that. Ask questions. Learn what you're entitled to and what you need to prove. Fifth, if you're contributing to a business that you don't have formal ownership in, have a conversation with your partner about equity. Do it kindly, but firmly. Explain that you want to make sure your contributions are recognized legally, not just emotionally. If they resist, that's information. Pay attention to it. Sixth, read your state's laws on marital property and business ownership. You don't need to become an expert, but you need to understand the basics. Google is free. The information is out there. Educate yourself. Seventh, if you have children, start teaching them about money, about business, about protecting themselves. Age-appropriate lessons, but start early. Financial literacy is one of the greatest gifts you can give. Eighth, connect with other people who have been through similar situations. Online communities, local support groups, professional networks. You're not alone in this, and learning from others' experiences can save you years of mistakes. Ninth, trust your instincts. If something feels off, if you feel undervalued, if you sense that your contributions are being minimized, don't ignore that feeling. Investigate it, address it, protect yourself. And 10th, remember that protecting yourself is not a betrayal of love. It's an act of self-respect. It's acknowledging that you matter, that your work matters, that your future matters. And anyone who truly loves you will understand that. This educational component isn't just theory, it's practical strategy based on real experience. My experience, and the experiences of countless other people who learned these lessons the hard way. You don't have to learn them the hard way. You can learn them now, while you still have time to implement them, while you can still protect yourself before crisis hits. Because crisis will hit. Maybe not divorce, maybe not business dissolution, but something. Life is unpredictable. Relationships change, circumstances shift. And when they do, you want to be prepared. You want to be protected. You want to be able to look back and know you did everything possible to safeguard your future. That's not paranoia. That's wisdom. That's maturity. That's self-love practiced through action. So take these lessons, apply them, share them with people you care about, because knowledge is only powerful when it's used, and protection is only effective when it's implemented before you need it. Don't wait for the crisis. Don't wait for the moment when someone hands you divorce papers or tells you they're cutting you out or dismisses your contributions as insignificant. Protect yourself now. Document your work now. Build your independence now, so that if that moment ever comes, you're ready. Not with anger, not with fear, but with clarity, with evidence, with the unshakable knowledge that you did everything right and no one can take that away from you. That's the real victory. Not what you get from others, but what you build for yourself, the security, the dignity, the power that comes from knowing your worth and protecting it. Always.